We're almost halfway through our sermon series entitled Healing Divides, Prescriptions from the Sermon on the Mount. And it occurs to me it might be a good time for us to remind ourselves why this is such an important topic. As you all know, we're more divided than we've probably ever been in this country. We're divided politically. We can't even have discussions around the Thanksgiving table anymore without people getting upset. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are much busier trashing one another, or trash talking one another, than they are trying to do what's best for us. They're more worried about positioning themselves to stay in power or to be in power in the next cycle than they are about what we need as their constituents. Politics has become a dirty word. The word politics has to do with the exchange of ideas so we can figure out what's the common good for all people, and now we can't even talk about it. We're divided religiously between Protestant and Catholic and Christian and Muslim. We can't even get along within our own church denominations, within our own church walls, without there being divisions and tensions. In the past 2 weeks, we've seen multiple school shootings. We saw 3 police officers in Houston be ambushed when they came to a call at a nightclub. A member of parliament was stabbed, and people in France were shot with bows and arrows. We live in a world that's increasingly violent, increasingly divided, and all the things that are happening make it hard for us to live our lives the way we'd like to live our lives. So we've turned to the Sermon on the Mount to try to find some solutions, some advice for how we not only heal divides, but how we keep them from happening to begin with. And we started with the Beatitudes, and we discovered that the Beatitudes are more than just a set of ideals we'd like to adhere to or aspire to. It has to do with our identity. When we're blessed or happy or fortunate to be poor in spirit, it means that we're humble, that we're dependent on God, and we realize our dependence on God. When it says blessed are the mournful, it's people who are in solidarity with people who hurt, people who don't have enough, who aren't recognized, who aren't treated fairly. When we talk about being peacemakers, we're all about reconciliation and not about revenge. And so we learn from the Beatitudes what our identity is if we call ourselves followers of Christ. And then Jesus told his disciples to be salt and light in the world that they lived in. And in spite of the persecution they might face because of it, he expected them to still be there for the common good, to do good works, not just for themselves and not just for their community, but so people would see that God does exist, that God is good, that God is compassionate, and that God cares through his disciples. And then we got into these antitheses that Jesus is talking about now. And the first one was about anger and murder. And we discovered that anger that Jesus was talking about was the kind that smolders inside us, that grows, and we fan the flames of that. We want to hold on to. We want to be angry. And when we stay with that anger, and when we let it brood and boil inside us, it ultimately can lead to violence and murder. And Jesus gave examples of what we should do in order to keep from getting to that point. And this week we're in the next set of antitheses that have to do with adultery, lust, and divorce. And Jesus says, "You have heard it said in old times of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that if you lust after someone in your heart, that you've already committed adultery." Once again, Jesus is memorializing the Mosaic law, the 10 Commandments, the commandment against adultery. But he's also saying, while that's important, what I have to say is rounding that out, and it's equally as important. And he gives us an example in hyperbole of how important this is. He says, if you do lust, if you can't control that lust, and your right eye or your eye offends you, that you should pluck it out. And if your arm offends you, you should cut it off. Can you imagine a world where everybody that's ever lusted was walking around without an eye or without an arm? Jesus was obviously speaking in hyperbole to make a point about how important it was to control the inner desires and the inner heart in our lives. Because what we think and what we feel ultimately becomes what we do. Jesus gives an example of what he's talking about here when he talks about divorce. He said, you've heard it said that you can give someone a writ of divorce, that you can divorce your wife. But he says, I tell you, the only reason you should divorce is because of adultery. And the word in Greek is porneia, and it can mean incest, adultery, or fornication. And Jesus wasn't so much concerned about divorce because of being misused, but about how it impacted families. You know, we've all been told since we were children that the basic unit of the society is the family. And when families break down, ultimately society can break down. You guys all know that I'm a product of a broken family, of a family that's separated and divorced. And I got to tell you, it has long-ranging circumstances. I'm 63 years old and I still deal with some of the effects of that traumatic experience in my life. There was a time in my household where my sisters and my mom didn't have much to say to me, where we didn't get along. And our extended family were forced into making choices about who they were going to support in this difficult time. So we know that divorce and separation can be a traumatic experience, not just for the couple involved, but also for the children and the entire family. I often thought that if I ever got a chance to write a book on divorce, the cover would be a picture of a little girl with a parent pulling on each arm, because that's exactly how it feels. You're being pulled in all kinds of directions that are outside of your control. And this is why Jesus is talking about this, because he understands the dynamics of society and family and the hurt and the pain that this can cause. Now, some divorces are friendly, no doubt. People realize that they just aren't compatible anymore, and they do it in a compassionate way that has concern for their family, their friends, and their children. In fact, there's a book out that I recommend to couples sometimes called The Good Divorce, and it teaches them how to have a divorce when minimally impacting their children and their futures. But it's hard no matter what. Now, Jesus, when he's talking about divorce, isn't talking about divorce like we think about in our day. According to the Mosaic law, you could give your wife a writ of divorce, and the point of the writ of divorce was to make sure that she was cared for, to make the divorce legal so that both you and her could remarry. Because in the ancient world, in a patriarchal society, without a male in your life, you were destitute. Your wife and children were liable to turn, or daughters were liable to turn to prostitution to make ends meet, or end up begging at the temple gates or at the gates of the city. So what was going on was men were abusing this privilege of divorce. For whatever reason, they would give their wife a writ of divorce. You burnt the dinner, honey. Here's your writ of divorce. Your hairstyle isn't quite as nice as the neighbor lady, so here's your writ of divorce. The wind is blowing funny and I can smell your BO. So here's your writ of divorce. And men were leaving the families they were responsible for destitute and without a means to survive. And this is what Jesus is speaking out against, not divorce. This is probably one of the most misused passages when it comes to divorce. Jesus isn't saying there aren't good reasons to get divorced. What he's saying is in these most intimate relationships, even when they fail, we have to take care of one another. We have to treat the other person with dignity and humanity as image of God. That's what God has called us to do. It's what he's called us to do in the world we live in, to no matter what the relationship, no matter what the circumstance, to care about other people, to be compassionate, even if we don't get along with them, to care for them, to make sure they have shalom and what it is they need to get along in this world. That's the point of this antithesis. It has less to do with divorce and much more to do with how we treat other people in the middle of conflict. And if we take all the teachings of Jesus, particularly on the Sermon on the Mount, and we begin to apply them, then we can find ways to not only heal the divides that we have already, but to keep those divides from happening in the future. And that's the lesson for today.